I want to talk today. I want to start out right now. President Obama and the president of Singapore, and nobody's mentioning, by the way, Singapore is not really a democracy. Singapore is an autocracy. It is an oligarchy. It is one of the more repressive governments that we deal with. Of course, South Vietnam, or Vietnam rather, is a communist government. China is a communist government, as much as everybody, Republicans and Democrats, love to bash Russia. We actually have communist and authoritarian governments all over the place that we're trying to cut the TPP with, this trade deal. And they're both like just aggressively pitching this thing, when according to Pew, only 11% of Republican voters believe that so-called free trade raises wages. That's by a 5-to-1 margin. Republican voters believe that free trade depresses wages. By a greater than 3-to-1 margin, Republican voters believe that free trade will kill jobs, not create them. This is from an article by Julia Hahn, based out of Janesville, Wisconsin, about Paul Ryan's support for the TPP. Paul Ryan yesterday spoke to a group of billionaires at the Koch network, and they gave him a standing ovation. They gave him whoops and hollers, according to the Washington Post, 400 wealthy conservatives, when he talked about how we need to have a free market system all over the world. And that means the TPP, which, by the way, is not a free market. It's 6,000 pages of regulations for a marketplace that works to the advantage of giant corporations run by the 400 billionaires in that room with the Koch brothers, and to the disadvantage of you, me, and everybody else. So how did we get here where both the Democratic president and the Republican Speaker of the House are pitching a trade deal that Americans across the board hate? It started in 1971. In 1971, corporations were not political, and neither, by and large, were wealthy people. They didn't, by and large, dabble in politics. They didn't push back against the top 91% tax rate. They didn't push back against a high capital gains rate. They didn't push back against a high inheritance tax rate. They didn't push back against rules that and the rules that would come actually over the next 5-10 years that create. Well, this was right around the time the EPA was created and all these other regulatory agencies. They didn't push back. But Lewis Powell wrote this memo in 1971. You can read the whole story about this in my book, The Crash of 2016. There's 2 chapters about it, actually. He wrote this memo in 1971 saying, hey, business guys. It was a memo to his neighbor and friend Eugene Sindor, the then CEO or chairman or president or whatever he was of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And he said, hey, businessmen, you've got to start getting political. You've got to take control of the political scene in America. And what came out of that 1971 Powell memo was 2 things. One, in 72, Richard Nixon put Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court, which led right to the 1976 Buckley versus Vallejo decision that Powell helped author, that wrote that when corporations or billionaires spend money on politics to buy politicians, that's not bribery. That's not influencing elections. That is First Amendment protected free speech. First time in the history of our republic that anybody had said that. Secondly, what came out of this was these giant think tanks emerged as a result of the Powell memo. The Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the competitive, whatever it is, there's just a whole bunch of them. And at first they're hired guns. Now this is back in the 70s. We're running around saying tobacco doesn't cause cancer, regulations is bad, taxes are bad, and most importantly, government is evil. Now keep in mind, in 1971, most Americans did not believe the United States government that George Washington fought to create and Dwight Eisenhower fought to preserve in World War II. The majority of Americans did not think that our government was an evil thing. The majority of Americans were very proud and patriotic Americans. But in order to work, for this Powell strategy to work, for this corporate billionaire strategy to work, it was first necessary to convince Americans that the government that Washington fought to create and that FDR and Eisenhower fought World War II to preserve was actually a bad thing. Now, it was bad in the minds of these billionaires because it was constraining their ability to rip people off, to produce substandard products or import them from countries like communist China or communist communist Vietnam, and it was impairing their ability to move our country's money all the way up to the top 1%. So in order to really turn America into an oligarchy, these guys first had to cripple the U.S. government and poison the minds of our citizens to hate government. So they needed a designated useful idiot. And they found that in 1980 in Ronald Reagan, who did just this with his inaugural speech saying government isn't the solution to your problems, government is the problem. And the 10 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. So he started this hate America thing, Ronald Reagan. That year, 1980, that Reagan became president, David Koch also ran for vice president as a libertarian on the anti-American government platform of the Libertarian Party. And I've ranted extensively about the platform of the Libertarian Party, but the 1980 platform that David Koch ran on, privatize Social Security, eliminate Medicare, do away with all forms of welfare and support for anybody who's poor in America, screw them all, and free public schools, privatize them all, let people make a buck off them, end publicly owned streets, septic systems, water systems, electric systems, privatize everything. Put everything in the hands of the billionaires. We'll take care of you. Koch and other billionaires figured that a better way to destroy our American government was to poison the minds of the American people, while at the same time feeding a bunch of candidates who would actively work within that agenda, and thus the Tea Party and Americans for Prosperity and other similar groups were born. Anti-government rhetoric, anti-American government rhetoric, funded by these billionaires, spread across the nation. The media thought it was a novelty and would get them ratings, so they covered it. I mean, even a dozen Tea Partiers showing up someplace was worthy of covering. A movement began. It took control of the Republican Party, while the Koch network became larger, more well-funded, had more employees in offices than the Republican Party itself, because the Republicans were still giving at least lip service to good government. The effort of these billionaires was basically to, as Grover Norquist said, shrink government down to the size where it can be drowned in a bathtub. And this was so successful that the billionaire-funded Tea Partiers took over the Republican Party in both the House and the Senate and ground them to a halt, even though the Zika virus is something, saying, oh, even the Zika virus is best left to the billionaires. The government shouldn't be doing that. They even boo the mother of a staff sergeant in the U.S. Air Force. He's a government employee, after all. Better to continue the process of privatizing our military. We should have Blackwater. We don't need no stinking army. These billionaires have been so successful that only in America they actually have an entire political party denying the biggest threat that humanity faces, which is climate change, because just acknowledging it would reduce the profits of the billionaires who fund the Tea Party. And into this pool of hate for American government stepped one of the Koch group's billionaires, a guy by the name of Donald Trump. Americans are just now beginning to realize how dangerous and toxic the Powell Memo's ideology was and is, but now it's almost too late to do anything about it, as not only have the monopolistic oligarchs taken over every single American industry, they've taken over the media as well. And they've supplied the voting machines to make sure only billionaire-friendly candidates ever win. And the only way to reverse this is to repudiate Powellism and Reaganism, let people know we've been scammed by the billionaires, and return to the idea that Lincoln talked about, a government of, by, and for we the people. And that requires getting money out of politics. We'll be back 15 minutes past the hour.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.